So a while back, I made what I would consider the ultimate guide to every single audio product that is out there, with the exception of speakers. It was a video that did absolute numbers and managed to get a few newbies into the hobby as well. At the end of the day, that video is just a surface level explainer. I didn't really go too much in depth with every single individual section. Every single section was just a few minutes long and maximum. And let me be clear, if I really drilled down into every single individual component, each section could be like half an hour long, which is this video. So hello, I'm Crinacle and welcome to the ultimate guide to headphones, sponsored by Sennheiser. Before we click away, let me just explain. This is educational content. I'm not trying to shill any specific product, though at some points there will be references to some examples. In those cases, it would be Sennheiser stuff. All right, let's just start from the basics. Chapter 1. Introduction to sound. So explain it like I'm 5. What exactly is sound? Simply put, sound is wriggling air. When the air wriggles around in specific patterns, that is what we hear as sound. The air waves enter our ears, which in turn stimulates a structure called the eardrum, which then stimulates a structure called the cochlear, not that kind of cock, and thereafter stimulates the hair cells within it. This is really just oversimplifying things a lot, but quite honestly, this entire section could be an entire chapter in a medical textbook. So forgive me if I'm trying to simplify. So what makes up sound is what we would call audio frequencies. In this context, our human ears hear between the range of 20 Hertz all the way up to 20,000 Hertz. So if you can imagine a piano right in the middle C, C4, would be at 261 Hertz, approximately. This is what we would call the fundamental frequencies. If you played this note, C4, on any other instruments, the lowest frequency that they would play would always be at 261 Hertz. But there begets the question, Crin, there'll be all these other instruments that can play that same note. So why do they sound different? Welcome to the world of harmonics. These are multiples of the fundamental. What that means is that you take the fundamental, in this case would be 261 Hertz, and then the second harmonic would be 261 times 2. The third would be times 3, the fourth would be times 4, so on and so on, yada, yada, yada. So what makes all these instruments different from each other, despite the fact that they all play the same note, is that the harmonic spray would be different from each other. An instrument like the piano, for example, would have a harmonic spray that is more emphasized towards the lower end of the notes. So you see that the harmonics kind of just spray downwards, so the highest would be closer to the fundamental. Then you have something like the violin, which sounds a lot more bright and airy compared to something like the piano, and you would see on its harmonic spray it has so much more upper harmonics compared to the piano. So you can see how all of this relates back to a headphone. A different headphone with a different tuning would make instruments sound different as well. Last but not least, we have amplitude, aka simply volume. Amplitude is simply how loud the sound is. So you could see that if you just vary the volume of even just a same note, you could also come up with a different sound as well. So for example, you could take a very bland singing voice, one note, no variation whatsoever, and it just sounds But what you could do now is just vary the volume up and down, make it wobble a little bit, and what you get is a very nice singing voice, a vibrato. This is also applicable to different instruments. For example, on the pianos, you have a very loud initial hit, which gradually falls off in volume as it goes on. Contrast this again to something like the violin, where you could have that sustained note without any kind of decay as long as you keep pulling the bow. And that's it. These are just the very basics of sound, just to give you some additional context before we move on to the more complex topics. For example, Chapter 2, the audio chain. Before we go into the whole headphones bit, we first have to talk about how the music goes from being a music file to becoming something that you actually hear with your own flesh and bone. The audio chain starts with the DAC, also known as the digital to analog converter. These take your digital files, typically your MP3s, your OOGs, your FLAC, your whatevers, and converts them into an analog signal. Analog signals are just signals that we as human beings can properly perceive, as opposed to digital signals, which are just simply ones and zeros. But at the DAC, once you take that digital signal and convert it to analog, it's still too soft for us to actually perceive anything. So what do? You amplify it. So the DAC takes the analog signal, sends it to the amplifier, where it literally just amplifies. So finally, the amplifier takes this analog signal, sends it to our headphone, where the diaphragm finally wriggles around, makes wriggly air, in which case we finally perceive it as sound. Of course, there are some exceptions to this. I'm assuming that you're just one of those 99% of people who are using digital music files. But if you're one of those weirdos who are using like vinyl, then of course there's no need for a DAC. You're just going straight from analog into an amplifier, which then goes into your transducer. But that's the general audio chain. You need a DAC, you need an amplifier, and then of course you need a transducer. In this case, the headphone. Chapter 3. The condensed history of headphones. The earliest headphones were made as a result of the telephone industry. If you can imagine, in the really old days, when you talk on a telephone, you would do something like this: receiver here, and then you hold up the speaker right up to your ears. This was fine, it worked, but if you can imagine, if you had a full-time job in the telephone industry, you would just be sitting there doing this the entire day. So in order to get a hands-free approach, someone would make a headband. Now, the earliest headphone was just simply one speaker on a headband, like your call centers nowadays. So now let's just talk about the 4 big firsts in headphone development. First of which will be the first true headband style headphone invented by Nathaniel Baldwin in 1910. The previous iterations of these kinds of headphones would be stuff that were mounted on the shoulder, or even like a stethoscope where you actually held the Y split as you talk. But this was just for the telephone industry, for people who had to sit down and actually talk to a receiver for hours on end. The second big development in the headphone industry would be the very first personal listening headphone, invented by Eugene Bayer, yes, that of Bayer Dynamic, in 1937. But at this point, headphones were still just mono devices. They don't differentiate between left and right. So the very first stereo headphones were made by John Koss, yes, that of Koss. It was made in 1958 and pretty much pioneered everything that we know today as headphones. And now we have the fourth big first in the headphone industry, the world's first open back headphones by Sennheiser, the HD414, invented all the way back in 1968. Now in the headphone industry, we have so much more competition, so much more variations, different driver types, different styles, but sometimes we just have to remember the greats, the initials, the pioneers. Next up, let's just talk about something simple. Let's talk about how you actually wear a headphone. Chapter 4. Headphone wearing styles. Simply put, there's really only 2 big categories of how headphones are built in terms of fit. First, you have the most common one, over-ear, aka circumaural. These are headphones with pads that surround your entire ear, and ideally, nothing should also be touching your ear. The advantages to an over-ear headphone would be comfort, of course, warmth, I guess, if you live in a very cold climate, and generally better isolation, at least in a closed back configuration. The disadvantage to such a wearing style would be size, because a headphone needs to be a lot bigger in order to surround your entire ear, and also warmth, assuming that you're living in a very warm country like I am. The other wearing style would be on-ear, aka supraaural. These are headphones with pads that directly press up against your ear. Nowadays, at least on the streets, it's very rare to see an on-ear headphone, and they're more common in, let's say, the broadcast industry or even the DJ industry. Now, there's some more unique subcategories of the on-ear form factor. For example, the ear clip form factor, which you would see in the Koss KSC75 or one of those weird Audio-Technicas. The advantages to an on-ear design would be the fact that it's smaller because you don't have to go around the ear anymore, and also the fact that it's now more breathable because parts of the ears would now be exposed to the outside elements. The disadvantages to an on-ear design, as mentioned, would be the fact that it's just not comfortable. Something pressing up to your ears for especially long periods of time is not really recommended. On top of that, assuming that you have a closed back design, you would have typically worse isolation simply for the fact that it doesn't surround the entire ear. And that's it. I don't think there's really much else in terms of wearing style. So let's just move on to the next chapter. Chapter 5. Types of headphones. So in the headphone industry, you have many different categories as well as permutations of these categories. You have your wired versus your wireless, your open bag versus your closed bag, your on-ear versus your over-ear, and just everything mixed in between. So let's now talk about the most common configuration in the hi-fi enthusiast market, which would be the wired open back over ear headphone. They're very popular for a few reasons. First of all, they're around the ear, so therefore they're much more comfortable. Second, because of its open back form factor, you would get typically better soundstage because of that. And third, the fact that it's wired, because audiophiles are absolutely allergic to wireless. Examples of this include the Sennheiser HD600, 650, the 660 S2, and my personal favorite, the HD800S. The second more weird configuration would be the wired open back on-ear headphone. This is the kind of headphone that's a lot more rare in the market. Sennheiser doesn't make these kinds of headphones, but you would see a great example in Grado or even Koss. The third style, and also quite popular in the market, would be the wired over-ear close-back headphone. These are headphones that are very common in studios. You would see them in a lot of music videos, for example. And it's really good because it allows for a musician to track their own instruments or even vocals without hearing their outside environment. A good example of this would be the Sennheiser HD620S, a new entry into the close-back market by Sennheiser, and is based on the design of the 560S. Next up, we have the wired close-back on-ear kind of headphones. These are headphones that are not quite as common in studios, and again, you would see them more often in the broadcast industry or even the DJ industry. The Sennheiser HD25 is an absolutely legendary headphone for this reason. You'll see them very commonly in the broadcast industry as variants with a microphone, especially at sporting events. And even within the DJ industry, the HD25 is considered a staple headphone, and every single DJ that's worth their salt have probably touched the HD25 at least once in their life. Now let's move away from the wired stuff and let's go into wireless. First of all would be the wireless close back over ear form factor. Very common nowadays. Especially when you have an ANC module built on, they'll be able to cancel almost everything related to engine noise. A good example of this would be the Sennheiser Momentum for wireless and over-ear headphone with ANC capabilities, and a headphone that I see constantly at the airport. The next category would be quite rare. It would be the wireless close back on-ear form factor. I hardly see this kind of headphones nowadays. Sennheiser had a headphone called the HD25 BT, but at this point they have discontinued it, and quite frankly it's just not popular in the market nowadays. And lastly, we have the wireless open back headphone, over ear or on ear both, because quite frankly I don't know any headphones that are like this. It's even rarer than the previous one. That's it. There are some gaming headsets that might be open back and wireless, I think, maybe. Put it on screen, maybe. Next up, let's talk about the things that actually make the sound. Let's talk about Chapter 6. Driver technology. So as I've mentioned, in headphones you have something called the driver. This is the thing that wiggles the air and makes the sound waves that we hear as human beings. But the way that you achieve such air movement can differ from driver to driver. So let's just go through the entire gauntlet, shall we? First, we have the most common driver type, which would be the dynamic driver. This is currently the most common type of driver in the market today. They are the easiest to manufacture at scale and are quite robust. If you see the cross section of a dynamic driver, you would see that the voice coils are actually perpendicular to the diaphragm. This is important information that I'll refer to later. This is the driver technology that is almost exclusively employed by Sennheiser, with the exception of the Orpheus and the HG1, which I'll get to later. The next driver type would be the planar magnetic driver, aka the orthodynamic. This is similar, but still different from a dynamic driver because the voice coils are actually etched or pasted onto the diaphragm. What this means is that the voice coils are effectively parallel to the diaphragm as opposed to perpendicular on a dynamic driver. The planar magnetic headphone was first created by Wharfedale in 1972 as the ID1. But after the ID1, planars didn't really get much traction in the hi-fi enthusiast market. They're always seen as kind of esoteric, a bit weird, some would say even gimmicky, all the way up to 2004 with the Fostex T50RP. The Fostex T50RP was a DIYer's dream, and at that point a lot of people came up with their own brands dedicated to just modifying the T50RP for a very small audience. I would like to also mention that the T50RP is based on a design called the T50V0 released in 1974, but this is just nerd talk that I like to throw out. Next up, we have the mysterious, the alluring electrostatic driver. Electrostatic drivers are completely different from dynamic drivers as well as planar drivers because they don't use the electrodynamic mechanism to move the diaphragm. Instead, they use the Yes, it's the electrostatic mechanism to move the diaphragm. But because of this, they also require a separately powered energizer in order to literally energize the diaphragm. Because there's no voice coils that need to be attached to or even etched into the diaphragm, you could say that the electrostatic driver has the lightest diaphragm out of any other technology currently used today. Now, electrostatic headphones typically occupy the higher end of the market. I don't really see a lot of cheap electrostatic nowadays. And there is case in point with Sennheiser, with the Orpheus as well as the HE1. These two headphones, in their respective lifetimes, were the most expensive production headphones in the world. The original Sennheiser Orpheus came in at a mouth-watering $16,000, and today we have the new HE1 coming in at $59,000 US. Now, in terms of esoteric driver configurations, let's not forget about ribbon drivers. This is a driver where you have a thin strip of metal, typically aluminum, held together by 2 points and surrounded by strong magnets. When an electrical signal is passed through, the ribbon wriggles around and literally creates the sound that we hear. This is very, very rare to see in the industry, and currently only Raw Requisite and Synaptic have ribbon headphones in their catalog. Next up, we have air motion transformer drivers, or just simply known as AMTs. These are similar to the ribbon drivers, but instead of having one straight strip of metal, they are folded and pleated instead. So instead of having like one strip of metal that is wiggling up and down, you have what is essentially an accordion movement that creates the sound. Most prolifically, this is a driver that is most employed by Head, Monoprice, as well as Bravo. And those are all of the big significant drivers that are used in headphones nowadays. There's some more weird examples, like for example, Final using BAs in their headphones, but I don't want to go through them too much. So next up, let's just say now you have your dream headphones. So what do you do from here? Chapter 7, caring for headphones. Let's put it out there, all right? Headphones are generally very durable, especially dynamic driver headphones like Sennheiser's. I want to make an example here. I'm not trying to shill, but the HD600 in my store right now is about 20 years old. They will never die. But that's the thing, is that just because something is durable doesn't mean that you can treat them like garbage. So let's talk about the ways that you can prolong the life of your already very long-lived headphones. First, let's talk about the things that wear out the quickest. Headphone pads. Let me emphasize properly. Pads are important. Repeat after me again. Pads are important. Pads and the wear that comes with pads absolutely affect the sound that comes out of your headphones. Look at the measurements here. These are two measurements of the same headphone with different pads. One with very worn pads and one with pads just fresh out the box. And you can see on this picture that the worn pad is just so much shorter than the actual fresh one. So yes, if you have been using your headphones for a very long time, you realize that your pads have worn out, worn down, then they absolutely would have changed the sound in some way. So here is my advice. Pads should absolutely be replaced at least on an annual basis, especially if you are going to be daily driving them. On top of that, if you're using something like velour pads, then I would recommend washing them at least monthly because of their porous properties. Next up would be on headphone stands. Now I know that there are a lot of very nice looking headphone stands if you just want to display your headphones or even store them in that kind of way. But my advice would actually be to watch out for those stands that require you to clamp the headphone onto it. For example, the Omega style stands. The fact that the headphone clamps onto such stands would probably result in the pads degrading faster than they should be. And if not touched for a long period of time, certain leather or leatherette kind of pads would actually begin to degrade and even melt onto these stands. Now let's assume that you have a much more fancy headphone, for example, an electrostatic headphone. Such headphones would typically require a lot more care and maintenance due to how fragile the entire mechanism is. The simple way that you should store them is with a dust cover, because dust is the enemy of electrostatic diaphragms. Either that, or if you have a HE1, then you have your own containment unit. That's great. Other than that, just don't throw around your headphones, don't poke at the diaphragms, and you'll be fine. All right, let's get deeper into the nerd talk. Next up, let's talk about Chapter 8, sound quality metrics. Oh yeah, let's just go right into the numbers here, folks. This is probably the section where a lot of you may start clicking off. So let's talk about the two big sound quality metrics that almost everyone is publishing now, which would be frequency response as well as distortion. First, frequency response, or as I would like to call it, the flavor of the headphone. Frequency response is currently the most identifiable of all the sound quality metrics, and for good reason. The simplest way that I can explain it would be that it shows how loud or soft a headphone is across the sounds that we hear. So as an example, we can show you how bassy a headphone is by how high or low the line is on the left side of the graph. Or can show how bright or dark a headphone is by showing you how high or low the line is on the right side of the graph. And if you would see the x-axis of such a graph, you would see that it is in frequencies, literally hertz. Now, there are some targets that you can hit in order to be regarded as a good tuning, for example, Harman or some variation of diffuse field, but they are not really guarantees of preference, though I would explain a lot more on this on a later chapter. The next sound quality metric would be distortion, or more specifically, harmonic distortion. The simple rule of thumb is bigger equals bad. Bigger distortion equals worse performance. But really, that's just an oversimplified rule of thumb. In reality, harmonic distortion, typically the ones that you would see published on the internet, is more nuanced than that. Certain distortions can actually be pleasant to hear. For example, second harmonic distortion on stuff like tube amps. The other thing about distortion is that it can show you bad performing products. For example, 10% distortion, that's terrible. Absolutely horrible. But on the flip side, low distortion is not necessarily an indication of good performance. For example, the difference between 0.001% distortion versus 0.00001% distortion, your human ears cannot detect the difference. As a side note, let's just talk about the other sound quality metrics, for example, CSD, aka cumulative spectral decay, or even waterfall graphs, impulse response, for example. These metrics are not very relevant in headphones due to the fact that headphones are minimum phase devices. What minimum phase is the fact that timing effects don't actually affect headphones at all. There's no such thing as ringing on headphones except in very bad cases. And if you're an engineer, you would also understand that all of these different metrics can be reverse engineered into frequency response very easily. So look, I kind of understand. They look pretty, they look colorful, they seem to show you more information than they actually do. But they don't. I'll leave it at that for this video because of time, but maybe in the future I'll talk about debunking about all this. Maybe, we'll see. Now that we have established that frequency response is the most important metric, let's now talk about Chapter 9. Understanding frequency response. As mentioned, frequency response is essentially the flavor of the headphone. You can see how loud or soft it can portray the bass, mids, and treble, and that essentially makes out to be the sound signature of the headphone. So let's talk a little bit deeper about how frequency response works, how it's relevant, and more importantly, how it's actually obtained. Currently, we measure headphones on what we call head simulators. We literally try to simulate the human head and how it hears that headphone with mics inside it. Currently, we have the big three in terms of head simulator brands. We have Grass, we have Head Acoustics, and we have Brew & Care. There's a lot of debate about the accuracy of each head simulator from each brand. For example, the Kemar versus the 4128 versus the HMS 2.3 versus the 5128, the list goes on. I won't dive too deep into it. Again, it's just a very small section of the entire ultimate guide to headphones, but just know that there is a lot of discussion behind all of this. Now, speakers are usually considered the holy grail. After all, the goal is to have your headphones sound like speakers. So what the science is that we can obtain a flat curve by placing this head simulator into a well-treated room with some good speakers. So targets are typically derived from adjustments of this flat curve. For example, tilted diffuse field, and even the Harman target. So the question that you probably have is, if a headphone doesn't hit the target, does that mean that it's bad? Not necessarily. It's really all highly contextual. So if you look at something like Harman, the Harman target is based on the average preference of all its respondents. So while there's an average curve as a target, in reality, straying out of your average preferred curve doesn't make a headphone bad. However, that doesn't also mean that every headphone is alright to some extent. You might have big peaks and nulls, you might have deficiencies in one area, overemphasis in the other areas. All of this would contribute to a sound that is just might not be too palatable or even just simply not objectively flat. So the best use of frequency response measurements is to use them in order to identify your own tastes. For example, you might like enhanced bass or even less bass. You want a more forward mid-range, a more pulled back mid-range. You want something that's bright or dark, all of which can be ascertained from an analysis on the frequency response graph. Next up, let's talk about something that's a little bit harder to measure. Let's talk about Chapter 10. Soundstage and imaging. First of all, soundstage. What exactly is soundstage? Simply put, it is the literal size of the room in which the sound exists in. In other words, it's how wide or open a headphone sounds. Headphones like the Sennheiser HJ100S are known for having extremely wide soundstage presentation. Typically, most people would prefer a more wide and open sounding experience as opposed to a more closed in one, but again, preference is weird. Some people I know prefer a much more intimate experience. So as a general rule of thumb, I would say an open back would usually give you a much more spacious presentation as opposed to a closed back, which tends to be a lot more intimate. But again, this is just a general rule of thumb. I know open back headphones that can sound very closed in, and I know closed backs that can sound very wide. Next up, let's talk about imaging, which is basically the shortened form of the words stereo imaging. Stereo imaging is the way that we human beings can determine the direction of a sound simply because of the fact that our ears are in stereo. In the headphones context, it is basically the relative positions of the headphones that exist within the soundstage, or just simply how accurate the headphone sounds in terms of localization. This is still quite highly subjective. There's not really a single metric that has been put up in order to determine the size of a headphone soundstage, but there are theories that postulate that just having a headphone that matches your own head-related transfer function would result in more accurate imaging. I'm not sure if I should explain HRTF and all of its effects right here. I think I'm running out of time for this section, so let's just skip it and let's move along, shall we? Next up, let's talk about some misunderstood metrics in the headphone space. Chapter 11. Impedance and sensitivity. So let me just refer back to my "you don't need an amplifier" video, because there is a lot of misconception that once you get a headphone, you need a very expensive amplifier to go with it. First of all, yes, headphones can be harder to drive than something like IEMs, but whether or not you need or require one, I think really boils down to whether or not you are hitting acceptable volume levels for your headphone. And how would you determine that if, let's say, you don't actually have the headphones on hand? Some people would refer to this metric: impedance. The simple rule of thumb is that the lower the impedance, the easier it is to drive, and conversely, if the impedance is very high, then it would be harder to drive. So this is the explanation that I see all over the internet, and also the reason why when people talk about hard to drive, they only reference the impedance number. But what people don't know, that they also have to consider one extra number, this one: sensitivity. So the misconception is only impedance is really relevant in determining whether or not a headphone is hard to drive. But the thing is, impedance really only tells you how much power an amplifier can send into a headphone. The higher the impedance, the less power it can send into a headphone, and conversely, with a lower impedance, you can send even more power. When it comes to the actual volume your headphone can actually hit, you have to see the sensitivity number measured in decibels per milliwatt. Sensitivity determines how loud a headphone can go for that amount of power, a single milliwatt. So simply put, the higher the sensitivity, the easier it is to drive. The lower it is, then the harder it is to drive. So because of this, a headphone with a high impedance can still be considered as easy to drive if its sensitivity number is very, very high as well. And on the flip side, if a headphone has a low impedance, then it also can be hard to drive if the sensitivity is also low enough. Such design can also be referred to as being current limited, because certain amplifiers can maybe provide the voltage required because of the low impedance, but can't really deliver the current. That said, on top of impedance and sensitivity, I think there's actually one more hidden metric that people should really consider, and that is output impedance. Output impedance is a metric that is for your amplifier, though at this point I would say it's not very common to be published on a spec sheet. Now, ideally, the output impedance of an amplifier, aka the Z out, should be as close to zero as possible. Now, I've seen on the internet that the general rule of thumb is that it should be the maximum of 1/8 of the headphone's impedance, but That's just the general rule of thumb. The more accurate rule of thumb is that as close to 0 as possible is best. Now, the output impedance of an amplifier can actually affect the response of a headphone in various ways. For example, it can result in a small bump in the mid-bass in the case of Sennheiser headphones. Tube amps especially have a very high ZL, which is also one of the reasons why they sound so different from your standard solid-state amps. And with that out of the way, let's talk about how you can tune your headphones. Let's talk about Chapter 12. Tuning and equalization. For those of you who are new to this channel, I refer you to the how to tune your headphones the easy way for a much more in-depth explanation. So what is equalizing? Equalizing is basically a digital, aka software, way to actually change the sound coming out of your headphones. Now, there are many ways that you can tune your headphones with equalization, and there's too many to talk about in this small section. So let me just boil it down into a few big points. First of all would be to use a low shelf filter. What this does is it essentially adjusts your bass level. The second would be to use a high shelf filter. Again, this is just another way to adjust your treble levels. Now, I would say that there are 4 big important areas in the frequency response that you should take note of. First of all would be the bass, the region of which I would say will be about 20 to about 200 hertz. This is where you get your punch, your slam, your thump, your insert adjective here. This is where you get the doof doof and the boom boom, right? The second area would be the lower mids, which I would say run from 200 hertz to about 1000 hertz. This is where you get the thickness, the richness, the heft that you get from your notes. But conversely, if you think that there's too much richness and heft to the point where they sound muddy, you can reduce them in order to get a bit more separation as well as clarity. The third range I would say would be the upper mids, which run from 1000 hertz to about 4000 hertz. This is the range where I'll say affects the shoutiness or even the forwardness of the vocals. If you think that the vocals are almost screaming in your face, then maybe just lowering down this range would help a little bit. But on the flip side, if you think the vocals are a little bit dulled over, then maybe raise them and you can get a bit more forward vocals and hear them much more clearly instead. And lastly, the treble regions, 4000 hertz and above. Adjust this range when you think you want a bit more brightness, a bit more sparkle in your sound. And conversely, if you think things sound a little bit sharp or even sibilant, then this is the range that you should lower down in order to make things a little bit more easy on the ears. But at the end of the day, this is just a brief explainer. I think this is the one aspect that really helps if you just tried it out yourself. Bring up your favorite EQ app, play around, adjust to your taste. There is really no wrong way to EQ. If you like it, you like it. Now let's talk about something that I, as a ex-reviewer, had to have. Chapter 13. Critical listening skills. Here's where I like to refer to another video called The Best
Song
to Test Headphones, ? Now, testing headphones is still largely a subjective thing, and I would say still largely learnable. Just have to know about the things that you have to listen out for. First of all would be my war cry of familiarity trumps technicality. You can have the most technical track in the world with all the dynamic range, all the bit rate, but it doesn't matter if you're not familiar with it. Use the songs that are familiar with you, where you can identify the small nuances. That is where you identify the most amount of differences when switching back and forth between headphones. You know exactly what to hear out for, and you can immediately tell when something is off, different, or even some weird detail that you never noticed that's suddenly there with that specific headphone. But in terms of the whole concept about critical listening skill, just understand that it is not a concept that you can immediately get right off the bat. It is, at the end of the day, a slow burn. My general advice is to start with one headphone. Just find out what you like or don't like about it, and if you can, try and EQ out the perceived flaws. Step 2 would be to find another headphone that is potentially more to your tastes using frequency response graphs, and then repeat point 1. Alternatively, if you have the privilege, I recommend you to just go down to a headphone shop like the Hangout, 200 South Bridge Road, and just run through the gauntlet. Everything that they allow you to test, just test it out and just find out your taste from there. Now I'm going to start shilling Sennheiser again. The HD600 has long been considered the industry reference point. It is a headphone that has been around since 1991 as the HD580 Precision, and so has the heritage as well as the neutral tuning that is still relevant today. So honestly, if you really want a proper reference point, there's a reason why all of us audiophiles are still using the HD600. It's proper flat, it's really neutral, and again, a long time reference point. And from there, just enjoy your journey, just compare headphones, compare tunings with your EQ profiles, but fair warning, once you hear it, there's no going back. And now lastly, chapter 14. Enjoy the music. Look, at the end of the day, we buy headphones for really just one ultimate role: to listen to music. So here's just a quick small reminder to not get caught up on all the numbers chasing and all the gear comparisons, and sometimes just forget about all of that. And also another reminder that we shouldn't disparage someone for having what is perceived to be lower end gear, because let's face it, this hobby, it's not a dick measuring contest. Let's not make it like that. And that's it. That's half an hour of just me talking about everything I know about headphones. And even then, I feel like I still have so much more to talk about. So I thank all of you for sticking with me all the way through this entire video. And now it's time for me to thank my big money boys. Here are all of your names if you're subscribed to the $20 tier on my Patreon. And now for those of you who have subscribed to my $30 tier, allow me to speak out your beautiful names: Dennis Crinacle, Andrew Posichronic, Seraphim, Like Pizza, Chemotherapy, and Daryl. I thank you all. A big thanks again to Sennheiser for sponsoring this video. And with that, I'd like to see you guys next week. And don't die. I can't say that on this video.